Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Elephant TV. My name is Joko Buthi. Today I'll be speaking to Tessa Knight. Tessa Knight is a research assistant for the Sub-Saharan region at the Atlantic Council Digital Forensic Lab based out of South Africa. Welcome, Tessa, to the Elephant.
Thank you so much for having me, Joe.
Great. I mean, how are you? How is South Africa?
South Africa's good. It's very hot. There's a lot happening in our politics, but otherwise it's great. I haven't left my house in a while. We've got our own new strain of COVID, so it's been exciting and also a bit scary.
Okay, man. I mean, same here as Kenya. I mean, we're heading to a third strain, I think, of COVID-19. I mean, we have hit our first wave, so we are maybe going to a third strain. So we are angst as well. But our politics, just like in South Africa, is also very angst at the moment because of next year. But I mean, we are keeping on as we should. So let me just get into this conversation. And recently, I mean, you wrote a very riveting report around how Ugandan elections and how the regime has been using social media to incite, raise propaganda, etc. But just to around the elections. I mean, if you could, I mean, for sake of our viewers, I mean, just outline the facts, the reasons that led to Facebook banning of all these accounts, particularly during the Ugandan elections.
Sure. So what happened is I was doing investigations ahead of the elections because I knew how important it was. And at the time that Bobby Wine was arrested, he was arrested a few times, but in November of last year, we noticed some of the hashtags, particularly Stop Hooliganism. And so I started to take notice of some of these accounts. And I noticed them on Twitter first. I saw that they were all sharing content from NRM politicians, and they were doing so within a few minutes of each other or even seconds of each other. And they were using exactly the same text. So it was just copied verbatim. And as a result, because I saw it on Twitter first, I then had a look at Facebook, and we're partnered with Facebook. So I sent some of that data through to them, these accounts that I was investigating, and they did their own completely independent investigation. And they came back to me and said that they had actually found a total of 450 assets. So that's Facebook profiles, pages, groups, and then also Instagram accounts. And they said that it was connected to the ICT ministry. So I had a couple hours to try and look at these accounts before they were taken down. Facebook took them down quite quickly because the elections were right around the corner. And on the 9th, so on Tuesday, Facebook came out with their report, and they said that they took down the accounts for government interference. So these accounts were, and profiles, pages, and groups were engaging in something called coordinated inauthentic behavior, right, which means they were all working together, they were coordinated, and they were going against Facebook's guidelines, and they were trying to deceive people and influence debates. So government interference is coordinated inauthentic behavior, right, on behalf of a government entity.
So you're saying that, so it's government entities are, in a sense, creating mass echo chambers of fake news, right?
Yeah, to an extent. They were primarily using it to amplify content for Museveni. They were trying to promote his campaign. So there was a lot of like hashtag Sevolution and hashtag securing your future. So they were promoting content relating to that and to the NRM. They were also promoting content to have Museveni's son, Muhoozi, as the presidential candidate for 2026. And then the third thing that they were doing was attacking Bobby Wine and NUP politicians and essentially the opposition. They were going after them. So that was the three things that these accounts were doing. It wasn't so much fake news, or as we like to say, disinformation or misinformation. It was more just inauthentically promoting and amplifying the content.
Okay, which leads us to the next question is that around now, in a sense, digital fascism around, because we have seen in the past, Cambridge Analytica, we saw, 2016 Trump's elections, etc., where you're amplifying this information towards a particular constituent. And I know here in Africa, because there are very many upcoming elections in the next 3-4 years. We had Uganda, next year is Kenya, and also we had Tanzania last year. So what's then the role of this digital space in really enhancing fascism or propping up strongmen that or manufacturing a particular kind of consent that is not really the will of the people? How has that manifested over it?
So I think something that we should remember is that when we think of digital spaces, we often think of the likes of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And ultimately, we have to remember that these social media platforms, they're still businesses, right? So at the end of the day, if they have a mass exodus of users, they lose out. So they have to think quite critically about the kind of content that they take down, or if, say, they deplatform someone like Donald Trump, that's quite a big move for these social media platforms. So certainly social media has allowed extremism to flourish, right? People have the ability to connect with one another, to share ideas. And we saw with January 6th in the US, a lot of the content ahead of that was shared on social media platforms.
Right.
So there are alternatives. There are platforms that don't have much content moderation. They're not necessarily as popular, but we have seen people moving away from some of the more prominent platforms like Facebook and Twitter to these platforms that are less moderated. And we've also seen people moving away from, say, WhatsApp to the likes of Signal and Telegram.
Right. So then how then do we, in a sense, how then do we create, use these platforms to one, of course, increase democracy, broaden the public sphere? Because in 10 years, for instance, social media has come from 2011, Arab Spring, Bouazizi lights himself up, and of course, organizing happened on social media to 2021. In a sense, this, the big tech and these big giants are posing a threat to our democracies, and people are beginning to doubt them because in many ways they're helping prop up fascist strongmen, not just here in Africa, but even as we have seen in the recent past, across the world. How then do we what do we need to do with these digital platforms?
That's a difficult question. I think we do need to remember that these platforms are not like exclusively used negatively. They're not just bad. They are definitely allowing citizens to, one, engage with one another and engage with democratic leaders and elected officials. So it's not all bad, definitely. Holding companies accountable is difficult because, as I said, ultimately they are businesses. They're not, I don't want to say that they're not democratic and they're not looking out for democratic principles, but when you sign up to Facebook or to Twitter, you're signing up as a user of their business.
Right.
So something that you can do is you can migrate over to free platforms. So the likes of Signal over WhatsApp. A mass exodus of users is probably one of the best ways to hold these companies accountable, because if a large number of people leave and say, hey, Twitter, we're actually deleting our accounts because of the way you're allowing this politician to remain on this platform, even though they're spreading disinformation, they're spreading lies about vaccines, that's usually one of the best ways to get these social media platforms to actually pay attention, because that affects them.
Okay, but my question then would be then, how do we make the internet a true public? I mean, there have been conversations about completely deprivatizing the internet. It becomes a completely public platform. How do we make the internet? Because in many ways, the internet was really seen by many people as one of the most democratic tools ever. But we've seen, of course, social media, particularly because of their business models, and as you rightly say, they are private companies. So, I mean, what drives them is profit. But then, how then do we make the internet, the internet and the platform of use to the public?
I mean, the internet itself is ultimately democratic.
Absolutely.
Again, like when we think of the internet, we think of Google, right? Google is kind of the first thing that comes to mind when people think of how they use the internet. There are obviously alternatives to that. There's a Explorer, I think,
right.
Is still a thing. But again, Google's a business. Google is not the internet itself.
Right.
When it comes to the internet, there's no governing body that says you can't create this website. You can't, set up this messaging board. So there are ways to do that. You can essentially create an entire new Facebook that is more democratic. That's probably maybe my answer to that. It's really
that's a catch-22. No, I hear you. I completely, it's really catch-22, which is, in a sense, we're still almost stuck to the fact that I think it's the limitations that we have, that we thought the internet will cure. We still face the same limitations, that we still require people to actually do the hard work of building our democracies, and not to tools and machines. But just moving forward, then, I mean, you rightly said that. I mean, maybe people can come up and advocate for these companies to deplatform people. But then, for instance, as seen in the United States after Donald Trump's Twitter handle was banned, there are, particularly among the conservatives and the right-wing, argument that has been that it's an infringement of freedom of expression, freedom of speech. So my question is that how do we move through this dilemma between, on one hand, that an individual or a company is propagating fake news, disinformation, divisive politics, but at the same time, we need to, there's an argument around freedom of speech, freedom of expression, that people can do and say what they want. How do we navigate this at the level of the polity? Because I don't think technology can fix this, but at the level of political discourse, how do we navigate through this very, very seemingly very, very murky space in protecting our open society?
Yeah, so Facebook deplatforming Donald Trump was quite a big move. And I think it's difficult because they have opted to deplatform essentially one political leader. And when it comes to leaders, Facebook is a little bit more, Twitter is a little bit more lenient because, the argument is that it's for a social good to have, one, access to these leaders, and two,
right,
for them to put their messages across. And certainly one can understand that. Their decision is a little bit difficult because it hasn't necessarily been applied to politicians across the world.
Right.
They deplatformed Donald Trump,
right.
But there are then politicians who have been doing exactly the same thing that
Precisely.
have not been deplatformed.
Exactly.
So that's a really difficult situation. And I think that's something that these social media platforms need to address, because one, like the decision to remove Donald Trump, you can be for or against that, that's fine. But in my opinion, if they're deplatforming someone like Donald Trump, that the decision to do that should be then a universal decision. One should be looking at political leaders across the world and how they interact with social media and applying the same standards to them.
Yes, it's hard. I think it's such a very hard question, like because it brings the question of loss of sovereignty, right? Are we saying these tech companies are they infringing on other people's sovereignties? I think there's a lot to be unpacked there. But I think that let's come closer home to Africa, where we are. And I mean, in a sense, I mean, Yuval Harari Noah in his book 21 Questions to the 21st Century says that Africa risks being left behind and becoming a useless class or a useless place because of us moving towards aggressive digitization, automation, etc. So, but then how then do we begin to bridge the digital divide in a context where majority of our leaders are extremely terrified of the digital space and the potential it portends? How do we begin to bridge digital divide? And then secondly, even to this is that what kind of conversations do we need to have? I mean, recently, I mean, as your report stated, is that I mean, not just were they fake accounts in Uganda and they were advertising people fake jobs. What we saw thereafter is that the internet was shut down for 26 days, right? That affected techies, creatives, people doing business, selling products online, etc. Then, so how do you navigate this new space of this new space within this particular context?
So yeah, as you said, there are governments on this continent that have an adversarial view of the internet and also
Right.
social media. Yeah, we saw that with Uganda. They decided to respond to the takedown of assets relating to the ministry by implementing a social media gag and then taking down the internet. That's not to say that they wouldn't have done that anyway.
Right.
We saw that Tanzania as well recently. So it seems to be becoming a more and more common response that governments shut down access to the internet a few days before an election. And that is, in my opinion, massively undemocratic because people are not able to engage with one another. If you deny people access to WhatsApp, which is what people primarily use to engage with one another, that's not democratic. People can't have conversations and they can't discuss the democracy. So the adversarial view on social media obviously makes it really difficult because these governments are then putting out the notion that social media is bad and it's not benefiting the country. And
precisely.
We saw that with Uganda right now. We saw the president saying that these social media platforms are not
useful,
democratic, they're not equitable, and therefore it's kind of a tit for tat thing. So he's just going to decide to shut it down.
Precisely.
It's really, really difficult to sort of unpack how one goes about bridging the digital divide in a few minutes, because it's something that affects this continent quite a lot.
Right.
I think, so we spoke about how in order to try and maybe come up with a social media platform that encourages democracy and isn't necessarily a business. One needs to start a new website. That can be quite difficult in African countries because one, you don't have the infrastructure to do so in a lot of places. Two, particularly in South Africa, data is hugely expensive.
Right.
Just getting online is massively expensive. It's really difficult to do so. Data, I mentioned data in particular because a lot of people use their mobile phones to access the internet.
Right.
So there's a lot of things that are preventing people from overcoming this digital divide. And I wouldn't say that it's making the continent, redundant, but certainly a lack of infrastructure, it impacts people and it makes it really difficult. It means that you have so many more hurdles to get over.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. Just to shift the conversation slightly back, something that you've mentioned around digital divide and what Museveni was saying. I mean, in many senses that both fascism and also anti-fascism learn from each other. The system learn from each other. So in a sense, uncovering what you've uncovered within the Ugandan elections, what are some of the lessons that you've seen, particularly in your report, that might be useful for other countries across the region and in Africa in terms of being vigilant towards particularly in the elections and in events that require the will of the people, so elections, constitutional changes, etc. What are some of the key things that highlighting them will be very important for the rest of us to be vigilant moving forward?
Okay, so your everyday citizen, when accessing information online, has to be so much more critical of that information now. You have to sort of see something and go, okay, is this legitimate? Particularly if it's coming from social media. What we saw now was there was one public figure, a politician, that was actually being impersonated. So this was a page that was pretending to be a politician and was being run by these accounts. So it's quite difficult. I have another report coming out, and that is actually on websites. And something that I would say when it comes to websites that you're getting your content from, a lot of us will think, okay, this is a news site, so it's likely going to be legitimate, and the information that I'm getting is going to be something that I can trust. So what I say to that is, if you see a website, you need to check if there's an author. Most legitimate websites are going to put an author to an article. Right. They might say reporter, but if they are saying reporter for all of their pieces, that's definitely something you need to look out for. If you want to go one step further, you can Google that author and see if they have any other work. But again, the user has to do a lot more work. I in the websites that I was just looking at, they appear completely legitimate. And what they did is they took press releases from the NRM, right. Copied and pasted it and presented it as breaking news with a fake name attached to it. That's really difficult. Like, how do you have to do so much work to try and figure out if that is truthful. Right. So it's hard, but I think just acknowledging that it's a lot easier for political actors or for really anyone that wants to spread disinformation, it's a lot easier for them to do so. So you have to just be hypercritical of the information that you're seeing.
Okay, I mean, my last question is that then what kind of society then do we need? Because I mean, I hear you, which is that we have to be hypercritical, but at what extent, such that do we not trust our neighbors, and to what extent do we need to be as a society to be able to really balance the scales?
Whew, yeah. So we, in a roundabout way, I'll answer you. Right. We classify disinformation as something that's false information with the intent to do harm. Misinformation is just the spread of false information, not necessarily with the intent to do harm. So disinformation is obviously something that we're really looking out for. Misinformation can be your neighbor telling you something that they heard and they're just passing that information on. Obviously, I'm not encouraging people to suddenly be absolutely paranoid and to not trust anyone. I think the information that you receive from the people around you and from your community can potentially be information that you should trust because it's right. impacting your community members. But say something that your mom forwards to you on WhatsApp that's being forwarded to her from someone else, that I would definitely, I would look that information up and I wouldn't take that as rote. That's potentially something that one should not be trusting of.
Okay, I mean, I think it's been a very hard conversation. I think you went it in a very interesting way. I think just what you're just basically saying is that we need to be vigilant as citizens, right? I mean, and there's no way to go about democracy. We just it falls back down to the citizen, and we need to be vigilant in protecting our democracies.
Yeah, absolutely. So the internet has been a tool to encourage democracy, and certainly it's allowed people to connect with one another. And I
Right.
would not say that it's been preventing democracy, but in other ways, it has had a negative impact on democracy. So it's kind of pros and cons when it comes to the internet and the online sphere.
Okay, man. Thank you so much, Tessa, for your time. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
It's been wonderful.